Hello everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel. I'm going to be working today with you on analyzing evidence. So what this is going to look like is we're going to go into step 3 of our essay process, and there will be several grids that we're going to fill out, or graphic organizers that we're going to fill out. And the reason that we're doing this is to talk about how to analyze evidence. Like, we shouldn't just be superficially summarizing the quotes that we choose, right? And step 3 of the essay process, while it is perhaps the longest step, by the time you're done with it, your whole essay will essentially be done for you. So I do want to look back at some of the things that we've done in the past in order to compare them to what we're doing now. So step 1, based on your reading of Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, determine the message the author is trying to present to the audience. Support your findings with reasoning from the text and literary devices, so on and so forth. So we went through this. We decided that our thesis was going to be this. Edgar Allan Poe suggests that no one can escape death, and trying to is an endeavor in futility. This is, if this is true, then people should do their best to help others and seize the moment to truly live life to the fullest. Okay? So that's what we're going to try to prove in our essay, and we're going to have to try to support that with relevant quotes from the text, all right? The 3 things that we want to talk about in this essay are Prospero's revel and imagery, the symbol of the clock and symbolism or metaphor, and the character of Prospero, characterization and metaphor, maybe. We'll see about the metaphor part. I give you this example of an introduction, and then we went through step 2 and we created this introduction right here. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to pick up my thesis right here, just so I remember what I'm talking about. All right, so let's go back to step 3. This is step 3. So it says organizing your evidence, right? It says do not use this idea or evidence. It is an obvious troll. That means that this is just a joke sort of paragraph here, but it shows you how the process works, right? So on the left where it has the quotation, we're going to actually put a quote here. We're going to cite it properly by putting these quotation marks, the page number, and the author's name, Godwin. And then in the middle, we're going to talk about the literary devices, or what the author is doing in this quote, all right? So this one says, this event occurs during the denouement of the story resolving the main conflict, Marilyn's presence on the ship. Ultimately, this description characterizes Barton as an old man, when throughout the story, the audience is led to believe that he is a rather young. And in fact, that's not really what this quote is doing. It describes him as old and weary, but that's because of the mental stress that he's essentially gone through, right? And to further make this kind of funny, I say this demonstrates the dangerous nature of taking a life. Barton must now sacrifice many years of his life in order to make up for the cold murder of Marilyn. Here we want to put why or how the quote supports our reasoning and our thesis statement, right? That's why I say that this is an obvious troll. Don't use it. It's not going to help you to cheat and copy that for your paper. It's probably not even related to what you're doing, and we're talking about Masque of the Red Death. Now, the cool thing about this chart is that if you use the chart well, if you fill it with language that is, good and well developed, if you use all your commas and stuff the way you're supposed to, what will happen is you can paste it together in this order, and it will become like a paragraph with evidence, right? So again, if we go up, red, orange, green, red, orange, green, I'm just taking the parts of the chart. So I say Godwin writes, and then I have the quote, and then I can go into my evaluation of that quote, saying, this event occurs, blah, blah, blah. And then I say this demonstrates and what it demonstrates, all right? So at the top of this box, we're always going to put the topic that we're talking about. So I copied my thesis statement. I'm going to actually just paste it right here so that I have it for reference. And it looks like the first thing that we need to talk about is the revel that is seen throughout the story. Okay, so we want to say one example in the story is the revel and how it is depicted throughout the story using imagery. Okay, because I remember from my beginning that I wanted to talk about imagery with that one. And that means that all of these how boxes are going to talk about imagery, right? Because it's the literary device, the specific technique that the author is using, right? There's a little bit of help for you here. It says you should have some sort of lead in and then a direct quote from the text. That means don't summarize and put quotation marks around it, because I've had kids do that before. Then it says page number, right? That you'll just put as the page number. You will not put page 16. You will not put number 16. You'll just put 16, for example, right? Like we did up here, all right? So there's this support for you, but you can also go back up to the example and check that out to be sure you're doing it correctly. Okay, so that's our first topic that we're going to talk about. Our second topic, I believe, is the clock. Yeah, the symbol of the clock. And we want to add a transition here because this will become our topic sentence. So we want to say something like, this is also seen through the symbol of the clock in the story. Okay, and we know that we're going to actually talk about symbolism in each of these how sections, right? You'll notice that I don't put the instructions here. If you want to have those, you can go back to the top one and see what you're supposed to do in that section. But eventually you should know how to work with these charts every time anyway. So reason 3 from your intro is going to be the character of Prospero, right? Now we want to say something here like, lastly, this is seen through the character of Prospero throughout the story. Okay, now you may notice that I say on the first one example, right? The second one I say this is also seen, and then I say lastly or finally this is seen through the character of Prospero. That's because when I put these into paragraphs, I want to have those transitions that make sense, right? Another way to put this first one is to start with a word like initially, comma, 1. Example in the story is the revel, right? Initially just means first, okay? So now we want to pick any one of these and then go and find a quote that supports it based on the story itself, all right? So actually let me Google or look up, I should have it in Classroom. Let me go to Google Classroom. It says there's no times that I use the word mask. I find that hard to believe. Alright, well, we'll just scroll down. It's right here. That's the PowerPoint, and that is the story. Okay. So, Mask of the Red Death, it begins with this dude Prospero, who is trying to avoid this plague on his people. And he goes into this castellated abbey in order to throw this sort of party for all of the rich people of his country, right? Now, the first time that I see that revel being described is going to be, I think, right here, all right? So it says, it was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell you about the rooms. So we're going to hear a little bit about the rooms, right? In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista. So it talks about how the hallways are actually crooked so that you can't see all the way down them. It says the Duke had a love for the bizarre. The apartments were irregularly disposed, so that would be like a type of visual imagery. But I think I want to talk about the 7th apartment, which is the one that's super creepy, right? So we get this description here. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries. that hung over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes were scarlet, a deep blood color. Okay. Now, the other reason that that is a good quote is that it's significant to our thesis statement, which has to do with death, right? So we go back to step 3. This is the first paragraph that we're working on, and we have room for 1, 2, 3 quotes in there. Now, a good essay should have about 6 quotes to talk about. You may have heard of these as 2-chunk paragraphs, which is totally fine. But I always ask for 6 quotes, right? A great essay has as much evidence as you can cram in there. I provide you boxes for 9 quotes if you wanted to, you know, go crazy. But I find that most students don't have too much trouble doing 2 per paragraph. So we're going to paste this here, Control V, right? The first thing I want to do to make sure this is correct is I want to put quotation marks around it. Okay. The other thing that students commonly mess up is that if there is dialogue in there, they don't change the quotation marks around the dialogue, right? So I want to see if there's any dialogue in the quote. Reading it, I don't see any, right? So that's fine. This comes from page 2, I believe. I'll just put that like that. I'll double check real quick. Yeah, 2nd page, right? And Edgar Allan Poe writes this, right? So we could just put something like this. Poe writes, comma, quotation mark. All right, that's one way to do it. We could also have a different lead-in, like in the story it says, in the text it says, the narrator says, or something like that. And if we did that, we would change this to Poe 2 at the end, right? Because we have to have the author, the page number, and the quotation marks, okay? So with this, we're hoping to talk about imagery, right? Because we said using imagery, all right? Now, there are 5 kinds of imagery. I know that off the top of my head because I know how imagery works, right? So there's gustatory, olfactory, there's visual, aural, and tactile, right? Each one of these is going to get a kind of different description because it affects our senses in a different way. So the 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, all right? That right there is visual, right? It's not something we can touch, taste, smell, hear, or anything like that, all right? It says it fell in heavy folds upon a carpet in the same material and hue, all right? Still visual. But in this chamber only, some of the window panes were a deep scarlet blood color, all right? Also visual. So this is basically visual imagery. We're gonna say in this moment, or at this moment in the story, comma, right? At this moment is actually an introductory phrase, so we need a comma there. In the story is like a dependent clause that is interjecting. Well, it's a prepositional phrase in the story that's interjecting into the sentence, so there needs to be 2 commas. At this moment in the story, Poe is describing the 7th apartment or room at the Revel. It is described as having a dark interior that is black with curtains. I'm gonna put heavy curtains because that's how it's described in the quote. And blood, we can actually put this in quotation marks. Windows that were a deep blood color. Okay. Now, when we can, we want to pull language from the quote so that we're being specific in our explanation. All right, what I did just now is I explained what's happening in the quote. The reason that I did that is because if your audience is given a quote and you don't explain what's happening in the quote, they may be confused. Like if somebody has never read this story, they're not going to know what's going on in that moment, because all you've done is like pull a moment out of the text and then put it there, right, into your essay. So with this description, I have pretty much accomplished a sort of idea for my audience so that they can understand what's going on in the quote. All right. The next thing I want to do is talk about the literary device or technique that the author is using, and maybe a little bit of like why are they doing that. All right. This description of the room relies heavily on visual imagery. Okay. That's dropping that term in there, right? That shows that I know the term imagery. I know that it's specifically visual imagery. This might say this would appeal to the sense of sight for the reader, but it also is also appealing to the sense of sight for the revelers, right? The reason that imagery is interesting is that it describes what something looks like in the story, but at the same time, there are two audiences for this, right? With the revelers who won't go in the room, and the audience who's reading it and feeling something about what they're seeing, all right? For us, the way the audience in the story is reacting is pretty much the same way as the way we're reacting as an audience, so we want to talk about that here. Because imagery creates a sort of ambiance or impact for the reader so that they feel as though they're in the story, right? So what we want to say is something like this. And I like the word dread here because dread is almost like a fear, right? And the revelers feel a sort of dread when they see this room, and so do we, because it's the last apartment. 7 is typically seen as either a very lucky number or a very unlucky number. It's black and red, black which could represent death, and red which they describe as blood. And we also know that the Red Death shows up as blood on the face of the characters in the story before they die. All right, so this creates a sense of dread for both the revelers and the audience reading, because if I can spell it, because the color of the windows is the same blood red color that they are trying to avoid. So this is a very lengthy, in-depth discussion of imagery in just this quote right here. All right, now this would probably get an A for this section on a paper if you were to be so fully describing it, right? Now, if you just said this quote creates visual imagery and it makes the audience scared or something like that, you're going to get a lower grade, but it would totally be acceptable. What this does is having this box here and these instructions, it keeps you from just rambling on about the quote, because sometimes kids will put a quote, they'll barely talk about it, and then they'll just move on to another quote. So having these 3 sections to specifically work with will keep you from doing that in your paper. Now the next section is, why does the author use the evidence, or well, use the text that way, or use that technique? And also, why does this help prove your thesis statement, right? So one thing that I might put here is this demonstrates. I almost always start this section with something like that because this demonstrates is a good lead-in to talking about why all of this matters, right? And that's why this section is the why section, okay? So this demonstrates that actually we want to start with our thesis. This demonstrates that, and let's go back up. Death is inevitable, and trying to avoid it is an endeavor in futility. This demonstrates that death is inevitable. I think it's only one N actually. Ew, I hate that Google does that. I just want to be able to fix it myself, because otherwise I'll never learn. This demonstrates that death is inevitable and an effort in futility because this room is the last room in the Abbey. It may, as a reminder, that death is the last stop in every life. Okay, so this demonstrates that death is inevitable because this is the last room. All right. Also, the way it is colored is very related to death, right? We wear black to funerals. We see blood or bloodiness as a sort of symbol of death in a way. I could add another statement here saying furthermore. That's a good transition when you want to like add something, or you could say additionally. But furthermore, the room itself is black, which is a color that people wear to funerals. And the windows are scarlet, which is often associated with with blood, which in the story is associated with the Red Death. Okay, so that's how all of this evidence ties together, right? We have this very creepy room at the end of the hallway. You might say, so what, right? Well, the author is using this visual imagery to create this sort of creepy room for a purpose, right? It's no coincidence that it's the last room, and it's no coincidence that it's black and red, right? Well, this demonstrates that death is inevitable and an effort in futility because this room is the last room in the Abbey, right? Also, Prince Prospero dies in this room, which we could end up adding here too. We could say this. Okay, which adds more sort of credence to the idea that this does represent death, and that death is inescapable, right? Now, the other thing that we do want to do is bring this back to this part, right here, this sort of deeper meaning, right? If this is true, then people should do their best to help others and seize the moment, you know, da-da-da. Now, we could do it here. I think it should occur at least once in the paragraph that you bring it back to this deeper idea, right? Or we could, you know, do it later on in the paragraph. But let's just say we were going to do it here. I'm going to use the transition ultimately. If everyone is on their way to that metaphorical last room, full of death, then people should attempt to be good to one another along the way and help others. Okay, this is important in the story because ultimately Prospero forsakes his people who are sick and decides to hide away in his abbey, and in the end death ends up coming for him anyway, right? Now, he could have actually helped his people by giving them resources, by, you know, trying to ease their suffering, but he chooses not to do that, right? So I'm going to add a little bit here. This is important in the story because Prospero dies for nothing instead of easing the suffering of his people. Okay. Again, this is a very full description, right? The essence of this, section here is that we need to talk about our thesis statement. We need to talk about why the author's doing what they're doing, and we need to talk about basically this bigger idea. Okay. The bigger idea is more like the icing on the cake, and if you're able to make that mental leap, you're going to score more like in the A category because you have some insight into the text. All right. Now, the cool thing about this is you might go, wow, man, that was a lot of work, right? And I do have students tell me that at times, that step 3 is like a monster, okay? But if you did it correctly, what you can do now is you just copy this right here, because this is our topic sentence, right? And you move it down to where we put our paragraphs together. You just press Control V, go back up, you copy this, you press Control C, you go down. Okay, go back up, pick up your how section, Control C, go down, Control V, you pick up your Y section, Control C, and you go down and you paste it, Control V. All right. Now, I know that you guys are taught in probably elementary and middle school that a paragraph is 3 to 5 sentences. Ultimately, you want to be writing until you've proven your point. You also want to be analyzing the quote until your audience can sufficiently understand the quote, right? Now, when we split it up in this way, again, it gives us a very clear focus of what we should be doing. It also brings in author's technique, which is a college skill, and it also brings our essay back to our thesis statement, right? Now, if I were to read this to you, initially one example in the story is the revel and how it is depicted throughout the story using imagery. So this would be coming right out of our thesis statement, so I don't feel as though there's a need to restate the thesis here. I'm going to unbold it because that should not be in the essay that way. I say Poe writes the 7th apartment all the way down to 2 right here, that description of the apartment, right? So I'm hitting my evidence. Then I say at this moment in the story, Poe is describing the 7th apartment or room at the revel. It is described as having a dark interior that is black with heavy curtains and windows that were a deep blood color, right? This description of the room relies heavily on visual imagery, so I'm hitting my literary device here. This would appeal to the sense of sight of the reader, but it also is appealing to the sense of sight of the revelers. This creates a sense of dread for both the revelers and the audience reading because the color of the windows is the same blood red of the Red Death that they are trying to avoid. All right. So I talk about the impact of that visual imagery. Not all literary devices require you to talk about the audience's response to the literary device, but imagery is definitely one of them that does, right? And when I teach students this, I say, hey, it's not just about what the room looks like, right? It's about why does it look that way? What is that doing for the reader, okay? So I say this demonstrates death is inevitable. That's this part right here. This is getting back to my thesis and stuff. This demonstrates that death is inevitable and an effort in futility because this room is the last room in the Abbey. Additionally, Prince Prospero eventually dies in this room. Again, because it's the last room in the Abbey, he has nowhere left to go. It may serve as a reminder that death is the last stop in every life. Furthermore, the room itself is black, which is a color that people wear to funerals, and the windows are scarlet, which is often associated with blood, which in the story is associated with the Red Death. I'm pretty sure that this is capitalized in the story, so I'm going to capitalize it here. Ultimately, if everyone is on their way to that metaphorical last room, commas here. Yep. Then people should attempt to be good to one another along the way to help others. This is important in the story because Prospero dies for nothing instead of easing the suffering of his people. All right, which is a good moral point to make, right? And this is why Poe probably does this, right? Prospero, being the leader, should probably be somebody who is watching out for his people, but he isn't. His name is also kind of ironic, right? Prospero, prosperous, while his country is falling apart all around him, right? So this is how step 3 works, right? There's also some scaffolding here for, how to write a paragraph if you're struggling, but you need to have a main idea or topic sentence. You need to give context for the quote, like, Poe writes, or what is Poe writing about? So I could add that down here. I don't have a lot of context. I just put Poe writes. So I could say this, one instance of this. Okay, one instance of this is the 7th room in the story. That lets my audience know that that's what I'm about to talk about, right? That's what we mean when we say that we need to add context. Okay, then we need our concrete detail, or our evidence, which comes next. Poe writes, down to right here, okay? Then it says you need to support the commentary, or support and do commentary. This is the how and why, and it brings it back to your thesis, right? Verify means to basically repeat this step with the concrete detail, support and commentary, and then you want to redirect or transition to your next paragraph, right? So let me show you what that transition would look like, just because a lot of students kind of struggle with that. So this is my second paragraph. This is also seen through the clock, right? So if my first paragraph is talking about imagery and I know I'm going into my second paragraph, let's pretend this is my second or third piece of evidence, right? I might say, additionally, this concept of death being inevitable is seen through the symbol of the clock. Right? Now that's in my first paragraph, but it's previewing what I'm going to talk about in my second paragraph, right? Then my topic sentence for my second paragraph would go here about the clock, so it's a nice transition between the two, right? It's like as if you're gluing them together, okay? Then once you're done with these, you actually just paste them together and your essay is complete except for your conclusion, all right? So your conclusion will be the last step that you're going to do, and I'll actually record a separate video on that. I hope this was helpful. These are kind of the ways that we really want to be talking about evidence to write an effective paper. And as long as you guys are filling this out correctly, spending time on it, and making sure that your sentences are well put together and your analysis is well put together, your essay almost can't go wrong, because you'll have no choice but to talk about the literary devices. You'll have no choice but to talk about your thesis statement, and then that way you can't forget what it is that you're supposed to do. So again, hopefully this video was helpful. Hopefully this scaffolding is helpful for you so that you guys can see how this all comes together. And feel free to like, comment, subscribe, communicate whether or not this was good for you, where you're still struggling, things like that would be totally helpful feedback for me. Or email me, message me on Google Classroom, or talk to me in Zoom. I'll see you next time. Thanks again. Bye.